everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to this series of book readings, particularly magic. I think I've only done Magic the Gathering books or novels. I do want to expand a little bit because I love lore. I really do, of all things. I think I did start off with a bit of The Witcher, but it didn't really take off. I don't think you guys were very interested because a lot of you were already into the whole Magic the Gathering arena thing, and you know, YouTube is people on YouTube are a little more specific, but on what they want. But I really do want to sort of expand later on. But now, since we are on the plane of Theros, on as a set. As the current set of Magic the Gathering, I think it was appropriate that we tackle this. So there'll be two parts of this. This is part one of Godsend. It's about Elspeth. For those of you who aren't aware or haven't seen Theros before, Theros is kind of like imagine the Greek world back then when they believed in Zeus. I don't know if they still believe in Zeus now, or the Olympians and whatever, but think Greek mythos. So like Hercules, satyrs, so like Poseidon, Odysseus, Oedipus Rex and all that. Before we start off, I just want to say thank you to all of you guys who have been here, and to the new ones who are just coming in, for supporting the channel, for subscribing, for watching my videos, finding entertainment in them. Every little bit helps. Every single view, every single like, every comment, your feedback, every time you click that subscribe button, that helps too. It helps with these algorithms of YouTube and all that. Although MtG isn't exactly this content of Magic the Gathering isn't really the main content that's making me money, but it is the one that's bringing in my subscribers. It's bringing in you guys, and I really enjoy doing these videos. Every now and then I'll make like a video game of a video of something else, a review or some tips, but that's just basically so that we can get the channel staying alive, because apparently those are the videos that people on YouTube mostly visit, and that's where the money is. But if you've noticed, that really doesn't matter to me, because what's important is that you guys are enjoying, that you guys are there, and so yeah, that's why I do these. And what's important is that I'm enjoying, and I really do enjoy these book readings, because I love to read, I love to voice act, I love to act in general. When I play Dungeons and Dragons, that's what I do. I love to role play a lot. Speaking of Dungeons and Dragons, there is a new source book that is ready for pre-purchase. You can buy it on Amazon. I won't put down the link because I'm not getting paid for that, but you guys can check it out. D&D Beyond, if you go to that website, I'm just endorsing for free. Then I'm not getting paid for any of this. So yeah, D&D Beyond also has that new source book coming out. If you're into Dungeons and Dragons, they have Theros, this new source book that revolves around Theros. Previously, they had one that revolved around Ravnica, which is the plane of the city, I think the city world as they call it. Anyway, I guess we should get into it, right? Prologue. Lydia's eyes flew open, and she was greeted by a darkened world. Instead of the gossamer curtains hanging around her bed, she saw the ancient trees of the Nessian forest silhouetted against the brilliant colors of the night. She wasn't at her home in Miletus, not even close. She hugged her sleeping son closer to her. His skin felt cool from sleeping outside, but his breathing was even and contented. A bird shrieked as it took flight from a branch above her. Through the gaps in the rustling canopy, she could see the god forms shift in and out of the focus. The night sky was known as Nyx, the realm of the gods. Every night, the heavens displayed fleeting visions of gods and celestial creatures. Some just lingered for seconds, but sometimes The Pantheon enacted entire scenes for mortal eyes to witness. Lydia rarely took time to step outside her home and watch the heavens, but now there was no place else to rest her eyes. Tonight, the god forms were vivid, and her heart beat faster as she watched their battle unfold. Perforos, god of the forge, thundered across the sky. He lunged for his brother, Heliod, god of the sun. Perforos's intentions were murderous. That was clear even to Lydia, who felt like a grain of sand compared to the majesty of the heavens. Both gods had taken human form except with epic proportions. In every frieze or statue Lydia had seen of Perforos, he always carried a bronze hammer, but tonight his weapon was a sword. Lydia didn't know what it meant when a god changed his weapon, but watching him assault Heliod, god of the sun, filled her with fear. Perforos's bronze face gleamed in the crimson flames that engulfed his sword. He swung his blade low as if he were trying to slice Heliod in half. Heliod parried with his sun spear and blasted searing light at Perforos. But his strike was not a victory, and the god of the forge emerged from the attack undaunted. Perforos slashed again, but Heliod evaporated into golden mist. Perforos's body transformed into divine fire, and the mist and fire fused together and appeared like a great rip across Nyx. Lydia frowned at the night sky, which now looked bruised and torn. It made her feel squeamish, like the time she'd fallen and gashed her knee. She half expected the sky to bleed. She rolled on her side and turned away from the battle raging above. She needed sleep and didn't want to be troubled by the affairs of the gods. Tomorrow would be a long day. Tomorrow she was going to find her son's soul. When they reached the Despair Lands, Lydia scanned the sky for locusts. She expected to see dark masses of them swarming above her. But when she and her son left the shade of the Nezian forest and stepped into the rocky expanse, there was nothing overhead but an oppressive grayness that shrouded the midday sun. Not even the wind blew across the forlorn landscape. The stark line between the Nezian forest and the Despair Lands seemed drawn by a god, and neither the trees nor the rocks dared argue with a god. Lydia had heard stories about the Despair Lands, which teemed with deadly locusts that ate the gold masks dropped by the returned who escaped the underworld. But Lydia saw no masks discarded among the scattered stones. No locusts, no masks. What else had the stories been wrong about? Her son, Daxos, whimpered and clutched her hand. Lydia, her unruly hair locked into a braid down her back, looked down and smiled brightly at him. With her oval face and large eyes, she looked barely old enough to be Daxos' mother. But she was 24 years old and was married to a wealthy merchant of Miletus, the city of philosophers at the edge of the great sea. Before this journey, Lydia had never ventured farther than a day's walk beyond the great walls of Miletus. Once, when she was a child, her father had taken her for a day trip out of the city. They'd ridden out of Hinter Gate between the giant statues and over the barren Four Winds Plateau. By late afternoon, they traveled all the way down Guardian Way and reached the edge of the Nezian forest. Her father stopped their horse at the point where the interlocking cobblestones ended abruptly and gave way to a dirt road. A dense wall of towering trees stretched for miles in either direction, and Lydia shrunk closer to her father. "This is the end of civilization, love," he said with a wink, and Lydia believed him. That was years ago, before she'd ever imagined herself as a mother with a child of her own. Her father had taken her only to the edge of the Nezian forest, But Lydia had taken her son into the heart of it, and then south to this land ruined by the breath of Erebos, god of the dead, who ruled the underworld. Lydia was shaken by a sense of disbelief. Had she really done it? Had she really made this journey by herself? Her husband made her feel as if she weren't competent to choose her own clothes. Yet here she was. Every citizen of Miletus would have been shocked to see her in the wilds near the entrance to the cave known as the Theros Shrine. Instead of appreciating the danger of the situation, Lydia's gentle mind was consumed with worry for Daxos, who was quite small to undertake such a journey. He'd just turned 7, but he was the size of a 4-year-old, and he was frail. As they picked their way across the foreboding landscape with its sickly air that dampened the sunlight, she kept up a running conversation with her silent son. As they approached the entrance to Theros' shrine, the red dirt beneath their feet became black sand that had no give under their boots. "What a strange place, Dax," Lydia said brightly. "A place with no grass or birds. I miss the bird song in our garden, and your swing under the lemon tree. But we mustn't worry, love. This will pass, just like night passes into day, and we'll be home in the garden soon." Lydia always tried to transform her mute, blind son's world into a place of joy through the power of her love. The truth was, she didn't know if he was truly blind or mute. She had seen many healers, and every one of them had insisted there was nothing wrong with his eyes, nor was there any physical abnormality that prevented him from speaking. But Daxos never spoke a word, and his eyes didn't focus the way other children's did. Most of the time, he just stared into the sky, transfixed by things no one else could see. Throughout his early years, her son made no move to explore his world like children his age normally do. When inside the house, he would sit in a darkened corner, but he was happiest outside in the sunshine. Sometimes Lydia would leave Daxos alone on the grass in the garden, and she would stand in the shadows of the archway and watch him. When he thought he was alone, he would move his hands through the air as though his fingers were tracing patterns that only he could see. Lydia could let this go on only for a little while. Then she would hurry to him and wrap her arms around him. She would clasp his little hands in her own until they were still and calm. Lydia couldn't bear to leave him to a life of solitary mindlessness. "Do you see that cave over there?" Lydia asked. She pointed at a brutal rip in the rock face. "It's where Theros dwells. It leads to the rivers that ring the world. We'll find what we're looking for in there." Lydia said it with a mother's confidence, and her voice was as warm and comforting as sunshine flowing through an open window. But she had no idea what she was talking about. She had visited dozens of oracles, the men and women who served as conduits of the gods. She had waited for hours at temples on special holy days, like Stormcast Festival, when Keranos was said to grant desires in exchange for a piece of sea glass. She had written prayers, lodged them in vials, and cast them before Pharika, god of affliction. She had tried every cure from everyone, magicians, charlatans, and liars, if they claimed they could help her son. But nothing had cured him. Nothing had made him like the other children. Then Lydia had heard a story from the old women who served her husband. It was a god story about children losing their souls at birth. These unfortunate children were not like the returned, who were dead but managed to escape the god of the underworld. Instead, the old women described children severed from their souls before they ever had a chance to walk the mortal realm. It was Erebos' pleasure to cause others pain, and if he could steal all the souls, he would. Such was his selfishness.
and bitterness at his lot. The despair lands were his fault, after all. The malaise and self-pity leaked out of the shafts of his realm and withered the earth. All who breathed his air too long became as miserable and joyless as he. After hearing the old women's stories, Lydia made up her mind. With no proof but her self-made conviction, Lydia decided that her son's soul, his eidolon, was wandering the world aimlessly, searching for his body. She believed that only Athreos, god of passage, could make her son whole. Athreos was the boatman who guided the dead across the rivers to the underworld. It was Athreos who remembered the names of the dead, the living, and the souls between. So Lydia filled a leather pack with gold and snuck out of her husband's house with Daxos in the middle of the night. It never once occurred to her that they might be slaughtered in any number of ways before they ever reached the Despair Lands. Lydia did have one creeping fear about the journey, though she prayed to Heliod to help her forget it. The fear became lodged in her head just after they stole her husband's favorite horse and set off down Guardian Way under the full color and glory of Nyx. The fear gnawed at her as they rode through the fields of yellow grain that bordered Miletus. When they entered the forest, her husband's horse became restless and bolted. They were forced to continue on foot, and the fear became like a knot of sickness in her throat. Lydia was afraid that even when they reached Athreos' shrine, she wouldn't be able to make the god understand what she needed. God spoke in a language all their own, the language of Nyx, or so the scholars taught in school. Lydia imagined if God language could be written down, it would simply be constellations of stars glittering across the page. Among mortals, oracles were the only ones who could interpret the god speak and translate it to the mortal tongue. And that was Lydia's problem. Although she had asked everyone she could think of, no one could tell Lydia whether an oracle actually dwelled in Athreos' shrine. In Miletus, there was an oracle in every temple. A towering woman with flowing black hair stood on a grand dais in the temple of Perforos and bellowed out his words of passion and fire. In Ephara's temple, a young man tapped a bronze staff in time while speaking steady words of progress and stability. Even in Pharika's murky temple in the catacombs beneath the city, a snake-like woman hissed the secrets of life and death. But try as she might, the only information Lydia could find about Athreos' shrine was where it was located. No living person had ever been through the Despair Lands to enter the sacred cave. No one could tell her if an oracle would be waiting to explain her request to Athreos. She was warned, however, of his love of gold. The dead must pay Athreos for passage, and his docks were littered with the coins of those who no longer needed them. His ever-growing caches rose like spindly mountains toward Nyx, or so said the old women. Lydia decided that if a soul was worth a single coin, then she would carry 100 of them. She reckoned that the return of a severed soul might fetch a high price, but she was confident she had enough coins to convince Athreos to answer her question. Where is my son's soul? With a sack of gold slung across her back, they closed the gap between themselves and the cave. But Daxos grew agitated as they approached the entrance to the shrine. His hands fluttered in the air, and his eyes were riveted on his mother's face. Lydia should have noticed his intense gaze on her, because it was so unlike her son to fix his eyes on anything. But she was distracted by visions of a golden happy future with a healthy son. In the shadow of the entrance, Lydia reached behind her neck and unfastened the amulet she had worn since she was a child. It was a delicate glass flower with 6 petals, almost star-shaped, that glowed pink in the strange light of Erebos' despair. She secured the amulet around Daxos' neck and kissed him on the forehead and both his cheeks. My mother gave this to me, and it was passed down from her great-grandmother, Lydia said. This is the flower that grows near my ancestral home, near the great sea. Daxos reached up and gently stroked the amulet, which pleased Lydia, because he had taken no notice in toys or other gifts that she had given him in the past. She took this as a good omen. It's all going to be all right now, she said, and rumpled his hair. She grasped his hand firmly, and they marched into the darkness of Athreos' shrine. Once inside the cavern, the rushing sound of a distant river reached their ears, and the boy stopped abruptly, tipping his head to one side as if to hear a little better. The cave was sparse and clean, as if it had been swept of all rocks and debris. The gray light from the entrance ended after a few steps, and Lydia stopped and fumbled in her pack for a candle that she tucked among the gold coins. It must be a little farther down, Lydia chirped, but her cheerfulness sounded artificial even to her ears. She knew a little fire spell, which was the only magic she could cast. When she had the candle burning, she led her son deeper into the darkness, and the sound of the river grew louder with every step. The fire danced along the wick, but remained small, almost non-existent, as if it were afraid to be seen. Abruptly, the darkness felt like a fist closing around her, and she hesitated in the middle of the tunnel. For the first time since she spirited Daxos away from Miletus, doubt consumed her. It hollowed her out and devoured her resilience. What was she doing here, alone and in the wilderness? If all the great minds of Miletus couldn't cure her son, what did she really expect to find in the savage wilds? Tears bloomed in her eyes as she was struck by the futility of this journey. Her abrupt change of heart was the work of Erebos, but Lydia didn't know enough about the nature of the divine to understand. Erebos whispered to all, "Resign yourself to misery." Such were the teachings of the Keeper of the Dead. "Oh, Dax," she said, sinking her heels and wrapping her free arm around her son. He leaned into her, the way he'd done as a small child seeking her warmth on cool nights. "I'm a fool, aren't I? A life with you in the garden is all I really want. However you are, whatever you see or don't see, I love you forever. You know that, right?" "Asphodel," he said clearly. In his palm, he held out the glass flower that she'd hung on the chain around his neck. Lydia was so struck by her son's first word that it took her a moment to understand that he'd correctly identified the type of flower that grew in the fields of her ancestral house. "That's right," she murmured, holding him closer. The little light from her candle was like a fragile bubble, and she glimpsed movement in the inky darkness beyond. Her son moved, so he stood directly in front of her. He gazed at her with wisdom far beyond his youthful age. Daxos' expression seemed perceptive and mournful, like that of a sphinx she'd once seen in Miletus. The reflective sheen of his eyes that she once had taken for blindness now reflected the stars of Nyx, and suddenly she understood what her son was, not deaf or mute, but a seer of things beyond her comprehension. Daxos was an oracle. The realization took her breath away. He spoke again, but the voice that emerged from his mouth was layered and immense, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. It was like the voice of the oracles that she'd heard in Miletus, speaking the language she imagined like glittering stars. "Your son is not safe here," said the voice from her son's mouth. At the pinnacle of the multitude of voices was a woman's voice, the voice of Karametra, the god of mothers. "You must flee." As Lydia rose to her feet, she could see a pinpoint of light racing toward them. The light of Athreos' ethereal lantern emerged from the depths of the cave. Lydia stared at her beautiful son and asked herself, "Where was my son's soul?" inside of him all along. He sees the divine more clearly than any oracle before him, the god voice intoned. Your mortal life is just a shadow compared to the glory of the gods. A stale wind blasted against her faces as Athreos lurched up the tunnel toward them. Beyond the orb of firelight, Lydia heard cries carried on the wind, the keening of those waiting for passage over the river to the land of the dead. Athreos, servant of the dead, is coming for your son, said the god voice. The Lord God of the underworld desires this vessel. Erebos will try to claim your son. Daxos was a speaker of god words, a seer of the veil, a star touched. He was a gift that all gods desired. Sobbing, Lydia scooped him up in her arms and ran frantically for the entrance. By now, Erebos had discerned what was happening from deep beyond the boundaries of the mortal realm. The tendrils of his tattered cape were like grasping fingers that tore at Lydia and slowed her escape. But he couldn't contain her. Daxos screamed his terror in the language of the gods. Through his god sight, Daxos knew that Erebos had heard his voice and would remember it for all time. He sensed Erebos rise from his throne. The god of the underworld urged Athreos closer to the daylight. Athreos refused to go beyond his dismal cave, but his hooked staff could reach farther than Lydia could flee. Because he could perceive all the gods, Daxos heard Athreos reaching for him through the winding passages. He sought to snare Daxos and deliver him to Erebos. Daxos tried to warn his mother, but the words that tumbled from his mouth made no sense to her mortal ears. Despite the dark intentions of the gods, Daxos heard a whisper of hope. Karametra recognized Lydia's overwhelming love for Daxos and took pity on the woman. Daxos heard the footfalls of a celestial creature racing to them. Karametra sent her own emissary, a giant sable, to encircle Daxos and prevent Athreos from pulling him away from his mother's embrace. But the fleet-footed sable was a heartbeat too late. Athreos had hooked his staff around the boy and dragged him deeper into the cave. Daxos could feel Erebos hungering for him as he outstretched his clawed fingers, so eager for a vessel that could touch the mortal world. Despite the strong arms of his mother and Karametra's aid, Daxos was slipping. Without hesitation or regret, Lydia traded herself for her son. The staff would not depart empty, so she squeezed her body into the crook and pushed her son to safety. Karametra's sable streaked into the cave, and Lydia begged it to bear Daxos into the sunshine. Then she let herself be dragged across the ragged waters to the unknown lands of the dead. And Daxos dug his small hands into the sable's fur, and he sobbed for his mother. With 3 bounding leaps, the sable had crossed the Despair lands to the relative safety of the Nessian forest. There, in the sunshine, Daxos heard Karametra talking to her sable. Leave the boy and come back to me. The sable hesitated, but obeyed. As soon as the child was laid onto the emerald moss, the sable was running back to his mistress and Nyx. Daxos curled onto his side under the spreading oak and wept himself to sleep. The gods may be whimsical, but they respected the fates, and Daxos was not Karametra's to claim, any more than he was Erebos's. The grieving boy would be on his own until he stood up or died in the elements. Daxos lay there for 3 days, clutching his mother's amulet and sorting between the noise of the divine and the din of the mortal world. Most mortals could only see the god forms in the night sky, and they were hazy and fleeting. But for Daxos, Nyx was a brilliant vision even in daylight. And for those 3 days, he watched the gods fight and listened to the pip and chatter of birds around him. He saw Perforos, the god of the forge, wield a gleaming sword that cut the divine fabric of Nyx with every blow. Daxos felt the mundane wind blow across his cheeks and rustle the leaves above his head. Finally, he was ready. He understood what things belonged in what realm. He could think in the language of his mother and still breathe the language of the gods. When he sat up, he found that he was not alone. There was a girl watching him. She crouched at the edge of the clearing, wearing a black cloak that was too big for her. He didn't know if she'd been there for 3 minutes or all 3 days. Her hair was brown, and her skin was pale, as if she'd been kept from the sun for a long time. And because he perceived the world in a multitude of complexity, he saw her grief like a prism, and it took his breath away. He'd lost his mother, and felt as if he might die of it. Whatever she had lost was so much more. "I need food," she said in a scratchy voice from a throat that needed water. They both needed food, Daxos knew. He was desperately hungry, and she looked as if she'd been starving for a while. There were strange markings on her arms, scars, but not scars, and the skin around her eyes looked like ash. He worried that the ashes might spread down her face until she was half ash and half flesh, and the winds of Theros would blow her to pieces. "None," he said. His voice was his own again, a child's voice, but he could still hear Karametra's words ringing in his mind like temple bells. It made it hard to focus on the mortal realm. "What's this world called?" the girl asked. Daxos didn't find her question odd. He could see both the god realm and the mortal realm, and probably the underworld too, if only he knew where to stand. Perhaps the girl was from Nyx, and she'd stumbled into the wrong place. But there were no stars shining in the shadows of her body, and all creatures born in Nyx had that same starry essence. "Theros," he said. The girl winced, like his answer hurt her physically. "I need food," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She hadn't asked it like a question, and even if she had, he didn't have an answer. He had no idea what to do next. She would just wanted food. He envied her single-minded purpose. The sun was setting, and Daxos stared at the sky as the gods came into sharp focus above him. Perforos was locked in a death match against Heliod. A god couldn't kill another god, but they would cause each other as much pain as possible. To the mortals, such a duel would be confined by a custom called Between the Pillars. But to the gods, the entire sky was their proving ground. "What's your name?" the girl asked. "Daxos," he said. "I'm Elspeth," she told him, but the boy made no reply. He was distracted by the brilliance of Perforos' sword, which the god had created in his divine forge. Heliod was weaponless. He'd flung his spear far to the north in a miscalculated strike. In the sky, the gods circled each other like wolves moving in for the kill. Daxos could perceive the history of their conflict etched into the foundations of the heavens. He knew that the god of horizons had warned them not to let their hatred spill from Nyx into the mortal realm, but their fury had consumed them. "Where's your mother?" Elspeth asked. It was strange that she didn't know that the gods were fighting. Daxos wondered if she perceived Nyx at all. She moved closer to him, but like a frightened animal, she crossed the glade in short bursts. He waited, motionless, watching the sky. Soon, she drew close enough to touch his hand if she'd wanted to. She stared at the glass amulet around his neck. Now the asphodel glowed green, reflecting the life of the forest. "Dead?" Daxos said. He hadn't yet put 2 words together in a sentence, but she didn't seem to notice. "I'm sorry," she said, but she made no move to comfort him. He perceived her silent plea, the one she made with the slant of her shoulders and the pits of ashes that were her eyes. "Please help me." Daxos didn't know what to do, so he watched the sky where Phoenix, the god of deception, skulked across the horizon above the skeletal girl. "I'll try," he promised. Daxos and the girl moved slowly through the night and the forest. Elspeth walked like she was broken. Daxos kept tripping over roots because his eyes never left Heliod and Perforos's battle. Finally, Elspeth took both his hands as if she were afraid he would fall and hurt himself. Elspeth's chin was bowed and her eyes firmly on the ground. Shafts of divine light illuminated the forest around them as Perforos's blade destroyed great swaths of Nyx. Daxos believed Elspeth moved with purpose up the mountainside. Years later, he wondered how the girl knew to lead him to the summit. If she had not been there to take his hands, he never would have found his way. But at the time, he was too distracted to give it much thought. He could feel the reverberations of the god war through the soles of his feet. At daybreak, they'd reach the timberline. It was just a short distance to the summit. The sound of bubbling water made them pause. A few steps away, there was a misty pond with unnaturally blue water surrounded by cattails. It was the domain of naiads, or water nymphs. Daxos could see the Nyx-born creatures shy away from the strangers. Elspeth fell beside the pond and drank her fill. She curled on her side in the grass and closed her eyes. Daxos was torn. He needed to climb higher to see the gods more clearly, but he didn't want to leave the broken girl. After their initial shyness, the nymphs approached Elspeth in a kindly way. She was an innocent, and they took pity. They wouldn't let her perish in the haven next to their healing waters. So Daxos continued his journey. Once he reached the summit, he had an unobstructed view of Heliod and Perforos. He could now see Perforos's sword clearly and marveled that such a thing existed. Perforos had designed the blade to bring chaos to the god realm. Heliod presumed to be the king of Nyx, and although Perforos couldn't destroy him, he would punish his arrogance. Perforos meant to lay Heliod low, to ruin his domain, and cast him shattered on the ground. He attacked with madness, and cared nothing of the wounds he was inflicting on the world. As they so often do, destruction and creation intermingled. As Perforos cut into Nyx, he rattled the celestial creatures that populated the night sky. He accidentally dislodged Polu Kranos, the world eater, from its heavenly perch. The 50-headed monster plunged toward the mortal realm, leaving a trail of Nyx blazing in the sky. Daxos felt fear echo in the belly of the gods, who knew what a disaster Polu Kranos would be to civilization. Heliod demanded help from Crufix, the eldest god. The god of horizons had inscrutable powers, even to the rest of the pantheon, and he could stop Perforos from destroying Nyx. Crufix unfolded himself from the edge of the world and swept across the sky. Perforos saw Crufix coming for him and turned to face him. But when Perforos turned, Heliod struck him with such force that the earth shook and water crashed over the sea wall of Meletis. The blow knocked the sword from Perforos's hands before he could retrieve it. Crufix had encircled him with his 4 shadowy arms, each the length of the horizon. Perforos's sword slipped through one of the gashes it had created in Nyx. Daxos watched Crufix drag Perforos away toward the edge of the world, but before he departed, Crufix entered the mind of every god and warned them in the immeasurable language of creation. "Do not threaten the mortal realm again, or I will declare a great silence. The gods will be threaded into the fabric of Nyx, unable to tread the land for as long as I will it." There was no time to protest the edict. The Hydra was about to be unleashed on the unprepared mortals. Heliod joined with Nylia, god of the hunt, who cast vines beneath the Hydra's body to ease its harsh entrance into the world. Below Daxos, the Hydra materialized in the valley and was momentarily stunned into stillness. Though much diminished in size, the Hydra could still destroy every human city unless it was immediately contained. Heliod didn't see Perforus' sword fall because he had become a winged horse racing across the sky to help his sister Nylia. Together, they trapped the Hydra inside a cavern deep under the Nezian forest. Of all the mortals in the world, only Daxos saw Perforus' sword enter the mortal realm. He saw it leave Nyx and come to rest on the summit near where he stood. It burned hot through the sky, but when it landed, it was small enough to fit a human's hand. Just as it was with the Hydra, the abrupt shift between realms had robbed the blade of its divinity. It became fundamental, comprised more of iron than of Nyx. Daxos whipped his head around and stared at it in shock. The devastating weapon of the god lay just a few feet from him in the red dirt. As Daxos struggled to make sense of what happened, a rejuvenated Elspeth climbed to the summit next to him. Jagged stellar light flashed in the heavens. Long strands of Nyx dangled from the dome of the sky from where Perforus' sword had damaged it. Below them in the valley, Nylia was still wrestling with Polukranos, who rebelled against the darkness of the cavern.
"Your world," Elspeth said. "It's too immense."
"Can you see his face?" Daxos whispered.
"He's everything."
As if in response to Daxos' question, Heliod revealed himself in blazing glory. He took human form and appeared as a man with black hair and flowing robes, but he loomed like a mountain on the horizon. It was as if he encompassed the sun. It shone out from inside his form. Its fierce rays radiated across the sky in victory. As Heliod turned to Daxos, the boy threw himself to the ground in supplication. Elspeth was awestruck by the immense visage dominating the skyline, but her home plane had been overrun with unfathomable evil, and things she didn't understand meant death. In her mother tongue, there had been a word for God, but it had become forbidden and dangerous. Heliod's divine light burned Elspeth's eyes, and she shielded herself from his blinding illumination. Behind her, Daxos raised his arms to the heavens and spoke.
"She died for me."
His words frightened Elspeth. She was afraid he was talking about her and the violence to come. She just escaped from a place of degradation and pain and had no intention of letting anyone touch her ever again. Her mind fought against itself. Part of her wanted to believe that this world was safe, that the god on the horizon wouldn't hurt her and might even protect her. The other part was like a rabbit, instinctively fleeing whatever she didn't understand. At that moment, she spied Perforus' diminished sword. Twin orbs glowed in the hilt like unblinking eyes. She didn't stop to question how it came to be on the mountain. She only thought of leaving. She didn't know where she was going, but somewhere else, with a smoother sky and smaller gods. Anywhere would have a measure of violence. She'd learned that already. And she had nothing with which to protect herself but her own hands. Elspeth's prey instincts triumphed. She ran forward, grasped the sword, and slid down the embankment. Hiding behind a boulder, she prepared herself to flee the world. By the time she departed Theros, Daxos had given himself over to his god.